incredible!
The ballroom was already glowing long before the evening officially began. Crystal lights hung from the high ceiling, filling the room with a warm golden shine. Round tables were covered with white cloth, polished glasses, and fresh flowers placed carefully in the center. Soft conversations mixed with quiet laughter as guests slowly found their seats. Everyone had come for the same reason. The annual charity evening was one of the most respected events in the city. Business owners, artists, teachers, retired couples, and generous supporters all gathered to raise money for children who wanted to study music but could not afford lessons. Near the front of the ballroom stood an old grand piano. It was not the newest instrument in the room, but it was easily the most admired. Its black surface had tiny marks from many years of use, yet it had been polished until it reflected the lights above. People often stopped for a moment to look at it before sitting down. Many believed the piano had its own history, carrying the memories of every musician who had ever touched its keys. A small sign beside it explained that the instrument had been donated decades earlier by a family who believed music could change lives. Since then, every charity event had included a performance on that very piano. As more guests arrived, waiters quietly moved between the tables serving drinks and small plates of food. Gentle piano music played through speakers while everyone waited for the live performance to begin. The evening felt calm, elegant, and carefully planned. Outside the hotel, the weather was cool. A light breeze moved through the nearly empty street as people hurried inside. Most arrived in expensive cars, wearing formal clothes that matched the elegance of the event. Not far from the entrance, a young woman stood still for several moments. She wore simple clothes that were neat but clearly old. Her shoes showed signs of years of careful use. A small shoulder bag rested against her side. She looked at the bright entrance, then quietly looked down again. She had passed the hotel many times before but had never stepped inside. Tonight was different. A poster outside had announced that the event would welcome anyone willing to support the music charity. Admission required a donation, but visitors were also allowed to attend as observers if space remained. She had read those words several times during the week before finally deciding to come. Even now, she wondered if she should simply turn around and go home. People walked past without noticing her. Some were busy talking. Others smiled at friends as they entered the building. She took a slow breath, held the strap of her bag a little tighter, and quietly walked toward the entrance. One of the hotel staff greeted her with a polite smile. "Good evening," he said warmly. She returned the greeting softly. I only wanted to listen," she explained. "If there is a place at the back, I won't disturb anyone." The staff member looked at the guest list for a moment before looking back at her. "The ballroom still has a few seats," he answered kindly. "Please enjoy the evening." Relief appeared across her face. "Thank you," she whispered. She stepped inside, careful not to attract attention. The ballroom looked even more beautiful than she had imagined. For a few seconds, she simply stood there, taking everything in. The lights, the flowers, the quiet music, and the old piano all seemed almost unreal. She slowly walked toward an empty chair near the back of the room. Some guests noticed her. A few exchanged curious looks. They were not rude, but they quietly wondered who she was. Her appearance was very different from almost everyone else in the ballroom. One guest leaned toward another and spoke so quietly that only the person beside them could hear. "I don't think she's part of the main guest list." The other simply shrugged. Maybe she came with someone. Their conversation ended there. The young woman remained focused on the piano at the front of the room. Her eyes rested on it longer than on anything else. There was something familiar about it. Not that exact instrument, but the feeling it carried. Old wood, carefully polished keys, years of music hidden inside every note. For a brief moment, she remembered another piano. It had stood inside a small repair shop where dust floated through the afternoon sunlight. Many of its keys had been worn smooth after countless hours of practice. She smiled without realizing it. The memory disappeared as applause suddenly filled the ballroom. The evening host stepped onto the stage. After thanking everyone for attending, The host spoke about the importance of giving every child a chance to discover music. Talent, the host said with a smile, does not belong to one neighborhood, one family, or one school. Sometimes it appears where we least expect it. Many guests nodded. The speech continued as the audience listened politely. Soon the host announced that the evening's featured pianist would begin the first performance. Everyone turned toward the stage. But instead of the musician appearing, one of the organizers quickly walked toward the host. They spoke quietly for several moments. The host's smile remained, but there was a hint of concern. A few seconds later, the microphone came back on. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host said calmly, "our pianist has experienced an unexpected delay because of an emergency on the way here. We hope everything is all right, and we expect an update very soon." The room became unusually quiet. People looked at one another. The schedule had suddenly stopped. Several organizers hurried behind the stage, making phone calls and checking messages. Some guests continued talking among themselves while others simply waited. The old piano stood alone beneath the lights. Minutes passed. The silence slowly became uncomfortable. The young woman watched everything from the back of the room. She could see the worried expressions on the organizers' faces. One organizer gently closed a notebook and sighed. Another looked toward the audience, clearly unsure what to do next. The young woman looked down at her hands. She quietly rubbed her fingers together. Then she looked back at the piano. A deep breath filled her lungs. She stood. For a moment, she almost sat back down. Instead, she gathered her courage and slowly walked down the center aisle. Several guests noticed her moving toward the front. Conversations became softer. Some wondered whether she was trying to ask a question. Others simply watched with curiosity. She stopped beside one of the organizers and waited until he finished speaking with another staff member. "Excuse me," she said gently. The organizer turned toward her. "Yes." She hesitated for just a second. "I know this may sound strange," she said quietly, "but if you still need someone, may I play one piece?" The organizer looked surprised. "You play the piano?" She gave a small nod. "A little." He glanced toward the empty stage, then toward the audience, then back at her. There was no confidence in her voice, no attempt to impress anyone. She simply looked sincere. Another organizer stepped closer. "What kind of music do you play?" she asked. The young woman smiled politely. "Whatever the piano wishes to remember." The answer was unexpected. For a brief moment, neither organizer spoke. The ballroom remained filled with waiting guests. The empty piano seemed to draw every eye toward it. Finally, the organizer took a slow breath. "We only have a few minutes before we decide what to do," he said kindly. "If you're comfortable, you're welcome to try." She thanked him with a quiet smile. Without rushing, she walked toward the old grand piano. Every step seemed louder than the last. Dozens of eyes followed her. Some guests looked confused. Others seemed doubtful. A few simply folded their hands and waited to see what would happen. She reached the piano and gently rested one hand on its smooth surface. For a second, she closed her eyes. The room became completely silent. Then she slowly pulled out the bench, sat down, placed both hands above the keys, and prepared to play. The room stayed completely still. No one spoke. The young woman sat quietly on the piano bench, her fingers resting only a few inches above the keys. She did not rush. She did not look around to see who was watching. Instead, she took one slow breath and gently touched the first key. A single note filled the ballroom. It was soft and clear. Then another note followed, and another. Within only a few seconds, the simple melody spread through the room like a calm breeze. The music was not loud, but every note carried warmth. It was the kind of sound that made people stop whatever they were doing without even realizing it. The conversations disappeared. The waiters stopped walking. Even the organizers who had been checking their phones slowly looked toward the stage. The young woman continued playing with complete focus. She was not trying to show off. There were no dramatic movements or fast runs across the keyboard. Every note had its place and every pause felt natural. It sounded less like a performance and more like a story being told without words. An elderly couple sitting near the front quietly held each other's hands. One of them smiled. "This reminds me of years ago," the older man whispered. His wife nodded gently. "It feels familiar." At another table, a music teacher listened carefully. Years of experience had trained her ears to notice small details. She could immediately hear something unusual. The young woman understood the piano. She was not simply pressing keys. She knew exactly how much pressure to use, how long each note should ring, and how every melody should breathe. The teacher leaned forward, unable to look away. The old piano itself seemed different. For years it had been played by many talented musicians, but tonight its sound carried a quiet depth that surprised everyone. The young woman treated the instrument with great respect. She never forced it. She allowed every note to shine naturally. Near the back of the room, one guest quietly said, "I can't believe someone we have never seen before can play like this." Another answered softly, "Maybe we've judged her too quickly." The music slowly grew stronger. The gentle opening turned into a beautiful melody filled with hope. It was not complicated. It was honest. The audience felt every part of it. One little girl attending the event with her grandparents sat completely still. She had been moving around in her chair only moments earlier, but now her eyes remained fixed on the piano. "Grandpa," she whispered. "Yes, I want to learn to play like that one day." The old man smiled. "You can." The organizers standing beside the stage looked at one another with relief. Just minutes earlier they had worried that the evening might fall apart. Now every guest was fully focused. One organizer quietly said, "This may become the most memorable part of the whole event." The others silently agreed. The young woman continued without looking at the audience. Her attention never left the piano. As she played, memories slowly returned to her. She remembered a small workshop filled with broken instruments waiting to be repaired. She remembered sweeping the wooden floor after school. She remembered sitting on an old piano stool while someone patiently explained that music should never be rushed. She remembered making mistakes. Many mistakes. Every wrong note had become another lesson. She smiled gently while continuing the melody. Those memories gave warmth to every note she played. The audience could not know what she was remembering, yet somehow they could feel the emotion inside the music. One businessman sitting near the center slowly placed his phone on the table. He had planned to answer several messages during the performance. Now he no longer cared about them. He simply listened. Nearby, an artist quietly closed her notebook. She had been sketching the ballroom before the performance began. Now she found herself drawing the outline of the young woman sitting at the piano instead. The entire room had changed. Only 15 minutes earlier, many people had barely noticed the stranger entering the ballroom. Now every eye remained fixed on her. Nobody cared what she was wearing. Nobody wondered whether she belonged there. Only the music mattered. The melody slowly became brighter. It rose gently before settling into another peaceful section. The sound filled every corner of the ballroom without becoming too loud. Some guests closed their eyes. Others simply smiled. A few quietly wiped away tears. Not because the music was sad, because it reminded them of someone they loved, or somewhere they once called home, or dreams they had almost forgotten. That was the special thing about simple music. Every listener heard something different. The music teacher sitting near the front quietly spoke to the person beside her. "Notice her hands." The guest looked carefully. "What about them?" "They are completely relaxed." The teacher smiled. "That comes from years of practice." She continued watching. People often think great music comes from fast fingers. It doesn't. It comes from listening. The guest nodded with new understanding. The young woman seemed to be listening to every note as carefully as everyone else. She never hurried to the next one. She allowed each sound to finish before beginning another. The old piano responded beautifully. Its deep voice filled the ballroom with rich tones that many guests had never heard from it before. One organizer quietly whispered, "It's almost as if the piano has been waiting for someone like her." The others smiled. As the piece moved toward its ending, the room became even quieter. No glasses clinked. No chairs moved. Even the kitchen staff standing near the doorway had stopped working for a moment just to listen. The final section was simple. The melody slowly softened again. It felt like watching the sun disappear beyond distant hills at the end of a peaceful day. The young woman's fingers moved more gently than ever. One note, another, then only a few remained. Finally, she pressed the last chord. The sound floated through the ballroom before slowly fading into silence. She lifted her hands from the keys. No one moved. Several long seconds passed. The silence itself became part of the performance. The young woman quietly lowered her eyes. She wondered if perhaps she had made a mistake by offering to play. Then, from somewhere near the front of the room, someone began clapping. Another person joined. Then another. Within moments, the entire ballroom exploded into applause. People stood from their chairs. Many smiled as they applauded. Some shook their heads in complete disbelief. The standing ovation continued much longer than anyone expected. The young woman looked surprised. She slowly stood from the piano bench and gave a small bow. She seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. The applause became even louder. One elderly woman walked closer to the stage. "Thank you," she called out warmly. "That was beautiful." Others quickly agreed. "It truly was. I haven't heard anything like that in years." "Wonderful." The young woman smiled shyly. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I only wanted to help." The event host returned to the stage with a bright smile. "I think," the host said while looking at the audience, "we have all just experienced something very special." The crowd answered with another round of applause. The host turned toward the young woman. "May I ask your name?" She hesitated for a moment before quietly answering. The audience listened with interest. The host smiled kindly. "Thank you for saving our evening." She gently shook her head. "I only filled a little silence." The audience appreciated her humble answer. It matched everything they had already seen. She had not walked to the piano looking for attention. She had simply wanted to share music. As the applause slowly settled, people began speaking quietly among themselves. Every table seemed to have the same conversation. Where did she learn? Has anyone heard of her before? Is she a professional? No, I've never seen her. Several musicians attending the charity event exchanged thoughtful looks. One of them spoke softly. "There is much more behind her story." Another nodded. "You don't learn to play with that kind of feeling overnight." Across the ballroom, one of the senior organizers quietly walked toward the host. "We should ask if she would be willing to perform one more piece." The host smiled. "I was thinking the same thing." The organizer looked toward the piano. The young woman was gently running her fingers across the polished wood, almost as if thanking the old instrument for allowing her to borrow its voice for a little while. No one in the ballroom knew that the evening was only beginning. The first performance had amazed every guest. The next conversation would reveal that behind the quiet smile stood years of sacrifice, hard work, and a journey that no one in the room could have imagined. The applause slowly became quieter, but the feeling in the ballroom remained the same. People were smiling at one another as if they had all shared something unforgettable. The organizers who had been worried only a short time earlier now looked completely relaxed. The host walked back toward the piano with a warm smile. "I hope you don't mind staying for a few more minutes," the host said gently. The young woman nodded. "Of course. I think everyone here would like to know a little about you." She looked at the audience and then back at the piano before answering. "There really isn't much to tell." A few people laughed softly. After hearing her play, nobody believed that. The host smiled. "I think we would all disagree." The audience clapped in agreement. The young woman looked a little shy, but she stepped closer to the microphone. "I've never spoken in front of so many people before," she admitted. "You don't have to give a speech," the host replied kindly. "Just tell us how you learned to play." She took a slow breath. "My grandfather repaired old pianos." The room became quiet again. "He wasn't a famous musician," she continued. "He fixed broken instruments that people no longer wanted. Some came from schools. Some came from old houses. Others had been sitting in storage for years. Several guests listened carefully. As a child, I spent most afternoons in his workshop. While he repaired the pianos, he would show me small things. At first, he only taught me where the notes were. She smiled at the memory. Later he showed me how every piano has its own voice. The audience remained completely silent. He always said you should never fight the instrument. You should listen first. A music teacher sitting near the front quietly nodded. Those words sounded simple, but they carried years of wisdom. The young woman continued. Our workshop wasn't big. In winter it was cold. In summer it became very hot. Sometimes only half the lights worked. A few guests smiled gently. But my grandfather never complained. She looked down for a moment. He believed that every broken piano deserved another chance. Then she added quietly, and every person does too. Those words touched many people in the room. An older gentleman removed his glasses and slowly cleaned them with a handkerchief. The host let the silence remain for a moment before asking another question. Did you ever take music lessons? She shook her head. No. So your grandfather taught you everything? He taught me the beginning. She smiled again. After that, I learned by practicing. How often? She gave a small laugh. Whenever nobody needed the piano. Several guests smiled. She continued speaking. Some days I practiced for hours. Other days I only had 10 minutes before another piano needed to be repaired or moved. What about music books? The host asked. We borrowed old ones whenever someone no longer wanted them. A woman sitting near the center quietly whispered to the person beside her. Imagine learning that way. The person nodded. It must have taken incredible patience. The young woman heard neither of them. She remained focused on answering the questions. When I couldn't understand something in the book, my grandfather would tell me to listen carefully. Listen to what? The host asked. The music. The audience waited. He believed music could teach you things that words couldn't. The room stayed silent. Then she added, so instead of asking how fast I could play, he asked whether I understood what the song wanted to say. The music teacher smiled again. She quietly whispered, that's exactly right. The host looked around the ballroom. I think many of us are learning something tonight. Soft laughter spread through the audience. The host asked another question. Do you still play every day? The young woman's smile became smaller. Not every day. Why not? She hesitated. Life became busy. She spoke honestly without trying to make anyone feel sorry for her. After my grandfather passed away, the workshop closed. Several people lowered their eyes. I had to find work. What kind of work? Different jobs. She smiled politely. Whatever helped pay the bills. She did not go into detail. She didn't need to. Everyone understood. There wasn't much time left for music. A quiet sadness settled over the room. But whenever I found a public piano, she continued, I stopped and played for a little while. One guest asked from a nearby table, so you never stopped completely? She shook her head. No. Why? She looked toward the old piano standing beside her. Because music never left me. Nobody spoke. The answer felt complete. One organizer standing near the stage quietly wiped away a tear before quickly smiling again. The host thanked her for sharing her story. Then another voice came from the audience. An elderly woman slowly stood. May I ask something? The host nodded. Please. The woman looked kindly at the young pianist. When you first walked into this ballroom tonight, were you planning to perform? The young woman smiled and gently shook her head. No. Then why did you come? I saw the poster outside a few days ago. She looked around the room. I knew this event was raising money so children could learn music. She paused. I wanted to hear people who had opportunities one never had. Her answer surprised everyone. She had come only to listen, not to perform, not to be noticed, not to become the center of attention. Another guest quietly asked, were you nervous when you walked to the piano? She laughed softly. Very. The audience laughed with her. I almost sat back down. What changed your mind? She looked toward the organizers. They needed help. The answer was simple. No long explanation. Just the truth. One businessman sitting near the front slowly crossed his arms. He had noticed her when she first entered. He remembered quietly wondering whether she belonged at the event. Now he felt embarrassed by that first impression. He wasn't alone. Many guests were thinking exactly the same thing. The music teacher finally stood. The room recognized her immediately. She had taught music for over 30 years and was respected by everyone in the local arts community. She smiled warmly. I hope you don't mind if I say something. The young woman nodded. Please. The teacher walked closer to the stage. I have listened to thousands of students over the years. She turned toward the audience. I have also listened to many professional musicians. Then she looked back at the young pianist. What I heard tonight cannot be learned through talent alone. The room became quiet once again. It comes from patience. She paused. It comes from humility. Another pause. And it comes from loving music more than applause. Several guests nodded. The teacher smiled kindly. I believe everyone here heard that. The audience applauded again. The young woman lowered her head slightly. Thank you. The teacher continued. I also noticed something else. The audience listened. You never once tried to impress us. The young woman smiled. I wasn't thinking about that. I know. The teacher smiled back. That's exactly why your performance touched so many people. The applause returned once more. The host waited until the room became quiet again. I think everyone here would agree that tonight has become much more than a charity dinner. Many people nodded. It has reminded us that talent can appear anywhere. One guest quietly added, if we're willing to notice it. The room responded with soft agreement. The organizers exchanged happy smiles. One of them stepped beside the host and whispered something. The host listened carefully before smiling. I have one more question. The young woman looked up. If you don't mind. She nodded. Go ahead. Would you honor us by playing one more piece? The audience immediately began clapping. Some guests even stood again. The young woman looked surprised. You really want another one? The answer came from every corner of the ballroom. Yes. We'd love to. Please. She laughed quietly. I didn't prepare anything. The music teacher smiled. The best music rarely comes from preparation alone. The audience laughed softly. The young woman looked at the old piano. She gently rested one hand on its polished surface. For a few seconds she said nothing. Then she looked back at the audience. If I play again. She smiled. I'd like to play something my grandfather loved. The room instantly became silent. Not because anyone expected something difficult, but because everyone now understood that every note would carry a piece of the person who had first placed her hands on a piano many years ago. She slowly returned to the bench. The lights reflected softly across the old instrument. The audience settled into complete silence once again. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody whispered. Nobody looked toward the exit. Every eye remained fixed on the stage. The young woman closed her eyes for one brief moment. She placed her fingers gently above the keys. Then, with a quiet smile that carried both gratitude and memory, she prepared to let the old piano tell another story. The ballroom became silent once again. Every guest watched as the young woman adjusted the piano bench just a little. She rested her hands above the keys but did not begin right away. Her eyes remained closed for a moment, almost as if she were remembering someone very important. Then she smiled softly. My grandfather used to play this melody at the end of every working day, she said quietly. He believed that no matter how difficult life became, people should always end the day with hope. The room grew even quieter. She gently placed her fingers on the keys. The first notes were calm and peaceful. Unlike the first piece she had played earlier, this melody felt more personal. It carried warmth that words could never fully explain. Every note seemed to tell the story of a small workshop where old pianos were repaired, where patience was more valuable than money, and where a young girl had learned that kindness mattered just as much as talent. People listened without moving. The melody slowly became brighter. It sounded like the beginning of a new morning after a long night. Several guests closed their eyes. Some imagined childhood memories. Others remembered parents, grandparents, or teachers who had changed their lives. The music reached every person differently, yet somehow it connected everyone in the room. The elderly woman who had spoken earlier quietly wiped away a tear. "It reminds me of my father," she whispered. The person beside her gently nodded. Across the ballroom, one of the hotel employees stood quietly near the doorway. He had planned to leave after delivering fresh glasses to one of the tables, but instead he remained there listening. Even the kitchen staff paused for a few moments. The melody had become the heart of the evening. The young woman played naturally, never forcing the music. Her shoulders stayed relaxed, and her hands moved with quiet confidence. She treated every note with care, as if each one deserved its own moment to be heard. The music teacher who had praised her earlier continued watching closely. She noticed something that many others did not. The young woman smiled while she played. Not because people were watching, not because they were applauding. She smiled because she truly loved the music. That kind of joy could never be practiced. It simply came from the heart. As the melody reached its middle section, the sound became richer. It was still gentle, but now it carried strength as well. It spoke of challenges, hard work, disappointment, and the courage to keep moving forward. Several people looked at one another. Without saying a word, they all seemed to understand the same message. Life is not always easy, but hope can still be found. When the final notes slowly faded away, the ballroom once again fell into complete silence. This time the silence lasted even longer than before. Nobody wanted to interrupt the feeling the music had created. Finally, applause filled the room once again. It was louder than before. Many guests stood. Some smiled while clapping. Others simply looked toward the stage with admiration. The young woman stood from the piano bench and bowed politely. She looked almost surprised that everyone had enjoyed the second performance just as much as the first. The host returned to the stage. "I don't think anyone here will forget this evening," the host said with a smile. The audience agreed with another round of applause. One of the organizers stepped forward carrying a small microphone. "If you don't mind," he said kindly, "we would like you to stay with us for a little while longer after the event." She looked slightly confused. "Of course. We have a few people who would really like to speak with you." She nodded politely. "I'll be happy to." The evening continued with dinner and speeches about the charity program. But even while people enjoyed their meals, most conversations returned to the same topic. The young woman. Guests who had never met one another before now found themselves discussing her music. "I've attended this event for 12 years, one guest said. "I don't remember another performance touching people like this." Another nodded. "It wasn't just skill. No, it was something deeper." Nearby, two professional musicians shared their thoughts. "The technique was excellent." "Yes, but what impressed me most was her honesty." The first musician smiled. "Exactly. She wasn't performing for applause." Later that evening, after the charity program officially ended, several guests gathered near the stage. The young woman quietly packed the few things she had brought with her. She was preparing to leave when one of the organizers approached. "There are a few people waiting to meet you." She looked surprised. "They want to meet me?" The organizer laughed gently. "They've been waiting patiently." She followed him toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. Waiting there were several musicians, teachers, and supporters of the arts. The music teacher stepped forward first. "I never properly introduced myself." She smiled warmly. "I've spent most of my life teaching young pianists." The young woman listened respectfully. "I've seen many talented students." She paused. "But very few people play with the kind of feeling you shared tonight." The young woman smiled shyly. "Thank you. I have a question. Please, have you ever considered continuing your music education?" She looked uncertain. "I've thought about it. And," she gave a small laugh, "I didn't think it was possible." The teacher looked at her kindly. Sometimes opportunities appear when we least expect them. Before the young woman could answer, another guest stepped closer. He was one of the directors of the charity foundation that organized the event. "I couldn't help listening to your conversation," he said politely. "I hope you don't mind." "Not at all," he smiled. "Our foundation helps young musicians." She nodded. "I know. Tonight you reminded everyone why we started this program." She looked surprised. He continued, "We usually support children." He paused for a moment. "But talent doesn't disappear simply because someone grows older." The young woman listened carefully. "We would like to help you continue your musical journey." For a second she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "I'm sorry," the director smiled. "We would like to sponsor advanced piano lessons if you're willing." Her eyes widened. She looked from the director to the music teacher. Neither of them appeared to be joking. "You mean?" "We mean exactly what we said." She remained silent. The offer felt almost impossible to believe. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to answer tonight," the teacher said gently. "Take your time." The director nodded. "We simply don't want tonight to become only a beautiful memory. We believe it should become a beginning." Those words stayed with her. A beginning. She had never thought of this evening that way. She had only wanted to listen to music. Now people were offering her opportunities she had stopped dreaming about years ago. Before the conversation could continue, another guest politely joined them. He introduced himself as the organizer of several community concerts. "I travel across different towns arranging musical events," he explained. "I would love to invite you to perform at one of them." The young woman looked almost overwhelmed. "I've never performed publicly before tonight." He smiled. "Then tonight was an excellent first performance." Everyone laughed softly. Another musician stepped forward. "I'd also like to invite you to visit our music center. We have practice rooms that are open during the day." She looked surprised again. "Really? You're welcome anytime." One offer became another, then another. Nobody was promising fame. Nobody was talking about becoming famous overnight. Instead, they were offering something much more valuable. A chance. The chance to learn. The chance to grow. The chance to continue doing what she loved. As the conversation slowly came to an end, the ballroom had become much quieter. Many guests were leaving for home. Before she walked toward the exit, the elderly woman who had asked questions earlier approached one last time. She gently held the young woman's hands. "Thank you." The young woman smiled. "For what?" "For reminding an old woman that beautiful things still happen when people least expect them." Her eyes became slightly wet. "You've given many of us more than music tonight." The young woman squeezed her hands gently. "I think your kindness has given me even more." Outside the hotel, the cool evening air greeted her once again. The street was much quieter now. She looked up at the night sky before slowly walking away from the building. Inside her bag was a small envelope containing contact information from the music teacher, the foundation director, and the concert organizer. She touched the envelope carefully. Only that morning she had expected another ordinary day. Now she carried something she had not held in a very long time. Hope. For the first time since leaving her grandfather's workshop years earlier, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps his lessons had not ended with his life. Perhaps they had simply been waiting for the right moment to open a new door. As she disappeared into the quiet street, the old piano remained inside the ballroom, silent once again. But everyone who had heard it that evening knew one thing for certain. Its beautiful music had not only changed the atmosphere of one charity event. It had quietly changed the direction of one person's life. The days after the charity event felt almost unreal. Every morning, the young woman woke up wondering if the evening at the hotel had really happened. Before leaving for work, she would look at the small envelope resting on her table. Inside were the contact details of the music teacher, the charity foundation director, and the concert organizer. For nearly a week, she did nothing with it. She was grateful for the offers, but a part of her believed they had only been made because everyone was caught up in the emotion of the evening. She worried that if she called, people might no longer remember her. One evening, After returning home from work, she carefully opened the envelope again. She looked at the first business card for several minutes. Then she smiled to herself. "My grandfather would tell me not to be afraid," she whispered. She picked up her phone and made the call. The music teacher answered almost immediately. "I've been hoping to hear from you," she said warmly. The young woman smiled with relief. "I wasn't sure if you would still remember me." The teacher laughed gently. "After a performance like yours, I don't think anyone who was in that ballroom could forget you." A meeting was arranged for the following week at a local music academy. When the day arrived, the young woman felt the same nervousness she had experienced before walking to the old piano. The academy building was larger than any place where she had ever played music. Long hallways echoed with the sound of students practicing different instruments. Some rooms held violin lessons. Others were filled with the sound of flutes, guitars, or singers warming up. For a moment, she wondered if she truly belonged there. The teacher welcomed her at the entrance with a kind smile. "I'm glad you came." "So am I." They walked slowly through the building. "This place looks wonderful," the young woman said. "It is," the teacher replied. "But remember, every great musician starts by simply walking through the front door." Those words eased her worries. The teacher led her into a quiet practice room where a well-kept grand piano stood near a large window. Sunlight filled the room. The teacher pointed toward the piano. "Whenever you're ready." The young woman sat down. This time there was no audience. No applause. Only two people and a piano. She began to play. When she finished, the teacher remained silent for a few moments. Then she smiled. "I was right." "About what?" "You have strong musical instincts." The young woman looked relieved. "But," the teacher continued, "there are still many things you can learn." She nodded quickly. "I know. And that's a good thing." The teacher pulled up another chair. "Talent opens the first door." She smiled kindly. "Learning opens all the others." That day became the beginning of a new routine. Several times each week, the young woman attended lessons at the academy. She continued working her regular job because she still needed to support herself, but every free hour was spent practicing. Her days became long. She woke early, worked throughout the day, studied music in the evening, returned home tired, then repeated the same routine the next morning. She never complained. Every lesson reminded her how much there was still to discover. The teacher corrected small details that she had never noticed before. Sometimes it was the position of her hands. Sometimes it was how she controlled the rhythm. Other times it was simply learning when not to play. "Silence is part of music too," the teacher often reminded her. Little by little, her confidence grew. She also met other students. Some had studied music since childhood. Others dreamed of becoming concert performers. At first, she felt out of place. She was older than many of them. She had never attended a formal music school. She worried they might look down on her. Instead, something unexpected happened. The students welcomed her. One afternoon, after hearing her practice, a young pianist smiled. "I've been trying to play that piece for months." The young woman looked surprised. "You play much better than I do." The student shook his head. "Maybe technically." He smiled. "But your music feels alive." She thanked him quietly. Those simple words encouraged her more than he realized. Weeks turned into months. The charity foundation kept its promise. They covered the cost of her lessons and helped provide practice time whenever she needed it. The foundation director occasionally visited the academy to ask how she was progressing. Each time, the teacher gave the same answer. "She works harder than anyone else." The director smiled every time he heard it. One afternoon, the concert organizer visited during one of her practice sessions. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he said. She looked curious. "The right moment for what?" "I have a community concert next month." Almost a year had passed since the evening that quietly changed her life. The same hotel was once again preparing for its annual charity gala. Workers arranged flowers across the ballroom, polished every table, and adjusted the lights until everything looked perfect. The atmosphere felt just as elegant as before, But this year there was a different kind of excitement in the air. Guests arrived one after another, greeting old friends and looking forward to another evening of music and generosity. Many of them remembered the unforgettable moment from the previous year when a quiet stranger had walked to the old piano and filled the room with music no one expected. Several people whispered as they entered, "I heard she's coming back tonight. I've been waiting all year. I told my family about her performance." Others had never attended before but had heard the story from friends or seen videos of her community concerts. Inside the ballroom, the old grand piano stood in the same place beneath the warm lights. It looked almost exactly as it had a year earlier, but it had recently been carefully restored. Every key had been checked, every string adjusted, and every piece of wood polished with great care. One of the organizers gently rested a hand on the piano. "It deserves tonight," he said quietly. Another organizer smiled. "So does she." Backstage, the young woman stood calmly, holding the same small shoulder bag she had carried the year before. It was no longer filled with uncertainty. Instead, it carried a few pages of music, a bottle of water, and the old photograph of her grandfather. Before stepping onto the stage, she looked at the picture once more. The faded photograph still showed the small repair workshop, the worn piano, and the gentle smile of the man who had first taught her to love music. She smiled back at the photograph. "I hope I make you proud," she whispered. The stage manager walked over. "They're ready." She nodded. "So am I." The host stepped onto the stage as the audience applauded. "Good evening, everyone." The applause slowly faded. Last year something happened in this ballroom that reminded all of us never to judge someone by appearance. It reminded us that talent, kindness, and courage can appear when we least expect them. Many guests smiled. Some already knew exactly who the host was talking about. The host continued, "Tonight we are honored to welcome back the very person whose music touched every heart in this room." The audience immediately began clapping. The applause grew louder as the young woman walked onto the stage. This time she did not walk alone in uncertainty. She walked with quiet confidence. She smiled warmly at the audience and gave a small bow. Looking across the ballroom, she noticed several familiar faces. The music teacher sat near the front. The foundation director smiled proudly. The concert organizer waved gently. The elderly woman who had spoken with her the previous year was also there, smiling with tears already forming in her eyes. Even some of the hotel employees who had worked during the previous event had quietly gathered near the back of the room whenever their duties allowed. She looked toward the old piano. For a moment, memories returned. She remembered walking toward it with shaking hands. She remembered wondering whether anyone would allow her to play. Now the same piano welcomed her like an old friend. She sat down and rested her hands above the keys. The ballroom became silent. She began with a gentle melody that felt peaceful and welcoming. The notes floated through the room with warmth and confidence. Everything she had learned during the past year could now be heard. Her technique had become stronger. Her timing had become even more natural. Yet the most important part had never changed. She still played from the heart. The audience listened with complete attention. No phones were raised. No conversations interrupted the music. Everyone simply listened. As the performance continued, the melody became brighter, carrying feelings of gratitude, hope, and quiet joy. It was as though every lesson, every practice session, every challenge, and every act of kindness she had received during the year had become part of the music. When the final note faded away, the ballroom remained silent for several seconds. Then the audience stood together. The applause seemed even louder than the year before. Many guests smiled while clapping. Some wiped away tears. The young woman stood and bowed. She looked deeply thankful rather than proud. When the applause finally settled, the host returned with a microphone. "I believe everyone here understands why we invited her back." The audience laughed softly before applauding again. The host smiled. "Would you like to say a few words?" She accepted the microphone. For a moment she simply looked around the room. A year earlier she could barely speak in front of strangers. Now she felt calm. "Thank you," she began. When I came here last year, I never expected to stand on this stage. She smiled. I only wanted to listen to beautiful music. Soft laughter spread through the audience. Instead, you listened to me. She paused. And that changed my life. The room became very quiet. I've spent the past year learning from wonderful teachers, meeting kind people, and performing in places I never imagined I would visit. She looked toward the music teacher. None of that would have happened without the people in this room. Many guests smiled. She continued, but tonight isn't really about me. The audience listened carefully. It's about every person who has ever believed that a dream was too far away. She paused once more. I almost stayed outside this building last year because I didn't think I belonged here. Several people lowered their eyes. I'm very thankful that I walked through those doors. The ballroom filled with warm applause. She smiled before continuing. My grandfather used to tell me that every broken piano deserved another chance. She looked toward the old instrument beside her. I think the same is true for people. Those words filled the room with quiet emotion. The audience applauded once again. The foundation director then joined her on the stage. He carried a small folder. I have one more announcement. The audience became curious. Our foundation has decided to create a new music scholarship. People listened carefully. It will help talented young people from families who cannot afford music education. The audience applauded immediately. The director smiled. And with her blessing, the scholarship will honor the kindness and determination that inspired all of us last year. The young woman looked surprised. She had known the foundation was planning to expand its programs, but she had not expected this announcement. The director handed her the folder. Inside was the official document describing the scholarship. She quietly thanked him. The audience stood once again. Many guests continued clapping for several minutes. Later that evening, children attending the gala were invited to meet her near the piano. They gathered around with bright smiles and endless questions. How long did it take you to learn? Were you ever scared? What if I make mistakes? She smiled at every question. I still make mistakes. The children looked surprised. Really? She nodded. Everyone does. One little boy asked quietly, so how do you get better? She smiled. You keep coming back to the piano. The children nodded. Another little girl asked, do you think I could learn too? The young woman knelt beside her. If you enjoy learning and you keep practicing, you'll surprise yourself. The little girl smiled with excitement. Before leaving the ballroom, the young woman walked back to the old piano one last time. The room had become quiet again. Most guests were preparing to leave. She gently touched the polished wood. Thank you, she whispered, not because the piano had changed her life by itself, but because it had given her the chance to share what had always been inside her. As she walked toward the exit, the music teacher joined her. You've come a long way. The young woman smiled. I still have a long way to go. The teacher nodded. I hope you always feel that way. They stepped outside together. The cool evening air felt familiar. Almost exactly 1 year earlier, she had stood outside the same building wondering whether she should walk through the front doors. Now she looked back at the hotel with quiet gratitude. She realized the greatest gift she had received was not the applause, the invitations, or the recognition. It was the chance to believe in herself again. The old photograph of her grandfather remained safely inside her bag. She knew he would always be part of every melody she played. As she walked into the peaceful night, she smiled, knowing that somewhere another young dreamer might be standing outside another door, wondering whether they belonged. She hoped her story would give that person the courage to take one small step forward. Because sometimes, a single step, a single chance, and a single song are enough to change the direction of an entire life.